Thank you very much for coming today. This is really a treat. We really appreciate you celebrating our centennial of collecting photography with us. As my colleague Ann Havika mentioned last week, the MFA was one of the very first museums in this country to do so. Collecting fine art photography it's hard to imagine, but was a brand new thing at that point, and we're very proud of that fact. But in thinking about writing a book about this topic and what its focus might be, we realized when we put our heads together that really early on we documented the history of fine art photography collecting in many ways over time, the three of us, the three curators who are speaking in this series. Anne's worked a lot on Alfred Stieglitz. I worked on the Lane collection. Kristen has been really focused on the Howard Greenberg collection. And it struck us what we hadn't done is consider the many other types of photographs that make up the collection and how, when, and why those works were first acquired and entered the museum. This was a surprisingly challenging process to characterize, as collecting photography at the MFA was never a linear process. It happened in fits and starts. Some of it was influenced by dealers and the market. Sometimes it was donors with special interests. For example, we have a wonderful friend in New York who collects snapshots, who's given us a huge collection of snapshots, and you'll see some of that in a minute. Other times it was simply the result of curatorial choice and preferences and the varying expertise among the three of us. Last week Anne spoke on science, art, celebrity, and fashion. She has many other interests, of course. And next week, Kristen's speaking on war, conflict, social change, and resistance, photojournalism, and things that Anne and I don't have nearly the same experience in. So this book, which we're celebrating and very excited about, here I'm showing you the cover, should be available in November, now that longshoreman strike didn't happen. And it represents what we see as a new way to think about the MFA's photography collection. It represents a recognition of the fact that these objects all have the capacity to tell multiple histories. And doing this research was a way to consider the amazing range of purposes for which these photographs were made and collected, because many of them initially were not destined for the walls of museums. And this reconsideration of the photographs in our care has helped us to realize that these often stubbornly mute objects, photographs can be very mute and very stubborn sometimes, in fact represent many potentially new narratives beyond a simple retelling of the canonical history of fine art photography. Some of our inspiration for the book and for this project also grew out of the very interesting project undertaken by our colleagues in Prints and Drawings, so a department we share space with and share storage with. For the last few years, they have been exploring an amazing group of more than 700 works brought into the collection by in the late 19th century by the founding curator of the Department of Prints and Drawings, whose name was Sylvester Curler. These pieces trace the history of virtually every type of reproductive printing process and technique known in Europe and the US at the time. And from what I understand, a number of the rarest and most important pieces in the Curler collection are camera-made or photo-based works. So believe it or not, even those of us who've worked at the museum for 20 plus years, some of these works, like the pictures you see here, we had never seen. We didn't realize we're here. And so this has been hugely exciting for us. Everything from photogravures and photolithographs to, here on the left, an enamel photograph printed on porcelain by Boston photographer Augustus Marshall, or on the right, a photoglyphic engraving by one of the inventors of the positive-negative process, the British photographer William Henry Fox Talbot. And this is interesting, of course, because it's an early precursor to the halftone print, which eventually allowed photographs to be printed in magazines and newspapers. So it was incredibly groundbreaking and fascinating to think that it's been sitting in our storage and we didn't know. Or we hadn't studied it. I'm sure someone knew it was there, but not me. As you can imagine, all of these discoveries right here in our own museum have been particularly compelling to reconsider now in light of the transition to digital photography, which really is nothing more than ink or pigments on paper, so very related in an interesting way. It's an incredible resource, and it's one I recommend to you. There's the link on the handout that was given out today, in case you want to learn more about it. But we're really here to mark the MFA's centennial of collecting and exhibiting photography, which as fine art, which began in 1924 with a wonderful gift of work from Alfred Stieglitz, and we've had all these works in the collection that came in before this, so whether it's 100% accurate or not, this anniversary really gave us a great excuse to write this book and to really celebrate the role of photography, the place of photography, and the history of photography here at the museum. Stieglitz was a major champion of photography at the turn of the century, and I hope a familiar name to some of you. A photographer, he was a New York art dealer, and an extremely influential spokesperson for the cause. He argued that photography should be considered the equal of all the arts, which is something it's sometimes difficult to put our minds back to a time when this wasn't the case. He gave us these 27 works in 1924, and I think showed an image of Georgia O'Keeffe, his wife. But I wanted to show another Georgia, his niece. I love this photograph. Because there were two Georgias in the family, they called her the Kid. And I just love this portrait of her standing in the doorway, very wonderful sort of adolescent pose. And as Anne mentioned last week, in case you weren't here, all of this gift and this, really remarkable addition to the collection came through and was because there was a friendship that existed between our curator of Indian art, Ananda Kumarasamy, who was an amateur photographer and great friend of Stieglitz's. And that is how the work came into the collection. It was through that relationship and his working with our trustees to make that happen. And there's a wonderful letter in the archives, which we're, again, sort of very pleased to find, which says that the Metropolitan Museum, so it's from Stieglitz to Kumarasamy, in which he says, the Metropolitan Museum has opened its sacred halls to photography. So they took the gift a year or two after we did. And I suppose Boston led the way, or helped pave the way. So that's really exciting. But let's start at the beginning. And I just want to say, I used to be the kid in school who would come home from at the day we got assigned different projects to work on, and I would always apparently tell my parents that I had gotten the best assignment of anyone. I was always excited whatever I had been given. For some reason, this really was the case. But I have to say, with this book and the projects the sections I was asked to write, it really was something of a stretch for someone who's been working on American modernism primarily for all these years. To start with, for example, expeditions and surveys, which is really centered in the 19th century. This was taking me back to my graduate school days, and something of a stretch, but very, very exciting to do, nevertheless. So my talk today is entitled People, Places, and Things, but I'm going to start with places. So today we'll begin by exploring distant lands, recorded by some of the mostly European photographers, who were in many cases the pioneers in this field, and all of these works I want to mention are in the museum's collection and in the book. Due to their bulky cameras, chemicals, and equipment, many of these photographers sometimes even required portable darkrooms. Most of these photographers traveled with a whole entourage of people with them. This was a complicated process, sometimes involving pack animals, often government commissions. This was not a simple enterprise, and these complex complex expeditions often required government sponsorship. So I wanted to start with the work of Francis Frith, whose work you see here, who was traveling in Egypt in the 1850s. Francis Frith is a British photographer who, he's a British photographer who here is photographing the pyramids at Saqqara. I just wanted to say, before I get into the details of this image, that all of these photographers active in the mid-19th century really were dependent on the fact that the veracity of camera-made images, the truth that people felt photographic images carried with them, and Anne talked about this last week as well. That trust in the inherent truth of photography made the camera really an ideal tool for the documentation and mapping and sometimes surveying of far-flung places and cultures. And acknowledging here, too, that sometimes this documentation also records colonial and imperialist histories that are more painful. Like many of his contemporaries, Frith traveled to countries, in his case, Egypt, that felt exotic and other, a destination like Egypt that most of England's population could never dream of visiting. This moment during the 19th century was also one in which archaeological expeditions were on the rise and helped spark the public's interest in photographs like this of ancient civilizations and the vestiges of those early cultures. Frith was very savvy in his choice of photographs, as you can see here, a choice of subject matter. He's captured the famous stepped tomb of Zoser at Saqqara and taken the additional step of introducing the foreground into the foreground and middle ground, two sets of figures to establish the massive scale of the pyramids. He was fighting extreme heat and dust in these desert conditions, and it's stunning what he was able to achieve while working with large wet collodion glass plate negatives, sometimes having to develop them in a floating darkroom. Here's the work of John Murray, another British photographer who was working, in his case, in India. The first couple of photographs I'm showing you today all have blank skies in them, and I think it's worth noting, and you can see it here. This is a very rare example of the fact that we sometimes have a paper negative and the print that was made from it. So on the left, you see the paper negative with the blacked out sky silhouetting the forms below, and then the print on the right where you see that even blank sky. Many of the early photographic emulsions were overly sensitive to the color blue, and as a result, early practitioners couldn't record both the land and the sky in a single exposure. So to get around that, that is one of the things that they did. Here you can see the 17th century tomb of Akbar the Great near Agra in India, and John Murray, who was actually a Scotsman, I described him as British, might perhaps not surprisingly preferred, rather than the glass plate negatives that many of the earlier photographers used, was working with paper negatives, which made it easier to work in such a hot climate. So the glass plate negatives had to stay wet or damp as the photographer worked, and that was not the case with the wax paper negatives. And by waxing the paper, if you think about holding up a piece of like parchment paper versus waxed paper, the waxing of the paper made it much more translucent. Murray spent 4 decades in India in all, and he worked at first for the East India Company as part of their medical services, but soon turned over almost all his attention to the documentation of Mughal architecture like this in his adopted country. This is one of my favorite photographs, and I'm happy to show it here. This is in the Lane collection, so something that Sandra Lane collected after the American Modernist material she and her husband collected together in the 60s and 70s. She began to branch out and collect photography from the 19th century. So Salzman was almost the exact contemporary of Frith. He is French rather than British, and in his case, his focus was what was then described as the Holy Land, an area of the Middle East we think of today as encompassing Israel and Palestine. During the mid-1850s, Salzman was commissioned by the French Ministry of Public Education to document the numerous archaeological discoveries being made in that region. Employing a large format camera and paper rather than glass negatives, Salzman set out to record architectural remains that would previously have been documented by painters and draftsmen. So again, depending on that public perception of the truth in photography, and the idea that something as systematic a study as this would be proof of the age and the construction materials that were used. He was working often very close up proving, he hoped, the relative age of some of the structures based on their differing construction materials. So he's focusing here on this 13th century Islamic mausoleum in a Jerusalem cemetery, and centering his attention on the masonry and the trefoil arch above the doorway. I think what I love about this is it's both documentary, but also, I would argue, incredibly beautiful and atmospheric print. So sort of plays both roles, as many of the works in the book and in this talk do. One of the works that I was not familiar with, because it's in our in our Japanese collections and in an album rather than something we normally would hang on the wall, is this amazing photograph by Felice Beato, who was an Italian-born photographer, traveled the world, a really major figure in the field in the mid-19th century, and one of those people who, kind of like photojournalists of the 20th century, was often in the right place at the right time. He was photographing things like the Second Opium War in China and the Sepoy Mutiny in India. He always seemed to be in a place where something exciting was going on. But he also took advantage during this period that this photograph was made in the 1860s. He took advantage of the fact that Japan had opened to outsiders and had begun to, tourists were beginning to visit, and suddenly there was a call for photography studios, and he was the first outsider to open a photographic studio in Japan during this period. He spent 2 decades there doing a thriving business and making and selling images like this one of scenes along the Tokaido Road, the tree-lined highway that ran between Kyoto and Edo, which is now Tokyo. This striking image of the great Buddha of Kamakura, like Frith's Egyptian pyramids, includes several what we would call staffage figures, so figures meant to show you the scale, the relative scale of this massive bronze sculpture. I love this. I'm going to say this too many times. This is another one of my favorites. This is a work by Auguste Rosalie Bisson, and another thread that runs through a number of these 19th century expedition and survey photographers' careers is a reputation for daring and a willingness to overcome all kinds of extreme conditions in order to secure a successful photograph. Bisson was one half of a pair of French photographer brothers who regularly collaborated and often signed their works simply Bisson Frères, Bisson Brothers. On this occasion, though, he was working solo, which might make you think, wait, who are all those other guys? Well, those are the 20 or 25 porters that were commissioned to go along with him, in this case, to make the ascent of Mont Blanc, the highest peak in the Alps. Here he's photographed the figures along the shadow that runs along this huge crevasse on the ascent to Mont Blanc, or at least that's what it looks like. They had suffered through blinding snowstorms and altitude sickness and avalanches, and here they were carrying a heavy wooden camera, fragile glass plate negatives up this really treacherous climb. What fascinates me about this picture, though, is this is really an example of one of the very earliest staged photographs that I know of this type, where apparently because the conditions were so difficult, and because there was such a challenge in making, he only managed to make 3 exposures on the entire trip, although they got to the very top. This is them coming down but turning back as though they're still climbing up, which I quite love. We were recently asked, the 3 of us were recently asked by a Globe writer to choose the photographs in the book that were our favorites. And this one, I have to say, came in a close second for me, another picture from the Lane collection. I'll show you my favorite in a minute. Carlton Watkins was an American photographer, again, maybe a name that some of you recognize, who very early on seems to have understood the power of photography to influence politics and sway public opinion. So he was something of a hero to people like Ansel Adams, which is why I've been thinking about his work for a while. He first began making photographs in Yosemite in 1861 under the auspices of the California Geological Survey, a government commission, again, needing that government funding to support such a huge undertaking. And he was the first photographer to do so, to be there. His spectacular mammoth plate views of this wilderness landscape, which, like the Japanese photograph, would have been printed and mounted, in this case, in a album. In the case of Carleton Watkins, originally, in the case of Carleton Watkins, we know that a group of these photographs sent to Abraham Lincoln at the height of the Civil War were shown to Congress and were thought to be a huge part of the thinking around Lincoln's deciding to set Yosemite aside as protected lands, even at the height of the war. So really powerful messaging around these pictures. But even with his obvious talents as a photographer, here you see his the double falls, Yosemite Falls. He was a terrible businessman, apparently, and soon after he made a whole series of photographs in the 1860s, he went out of business and went bankrupt, and his competitors took over all his negatives. So in the 1870s, he went back to many of the sites that he had made famous, like this view. So here he is in the 1870s returning, only to find that those photographs had popularized the place to such a degree, and so many people had come in the decades since his initial pictures, that no longer was this really the wilderness that he had photographed initially. And of course, any of us who've been there know this is a problem that continues. But here there are carriage paths and coach paths in many of these places, taking other people to that same view as well. I'm here showing that same Carleton Watkins albumen print, now compared to a very contemporary work by the Vietnamese-American photographer Binh Don on the right, made just a few years ago. This pairing allows me to mention another aspect of the book that my colleagues and I found particularly compelling. We closed each section, or sort of wrapped up each section of the book, with a few more recent photographs often, to help elucidate the ways that each of our chosen themes, so in this case, surveys and expeditions, could be reconsidered through a contemporary lens. How, for example, do we look at Yosemite Falls differently if we see it through the eyes of a relatively recent immigrant to this country? Arriving here as a very young child, after the Vietnam War, Don never felt any particular connection to national parks until he became a photographer and until he discovered daguerreotypes and went to Yosemite and made these photographs. And literally, someone who described himself as never feeling that he could see himself there, now making photographs that literally reflect, because of their highly polished surface, he literally can see himself in that landscape. And that cobalt blue, which is a little dim here in this image, but which is very strong in the actual photograph, would have been seen in the 19th century as something had gone wrong. Remember that overly sensitive emulsion to blue, the color blue. Don takes it and uses it in a very modern way, and that, I think, is exciting and fun to show in the book. Two more quick examples that are particular favorites of mine. Here, the work of conceptual and performance artist Eleanor Antin. If you don't know her work, I really recommend looking her up. She's definitely not a household name, and nor is her work often shown on the walls of museums, in part because of the nature of her medium, which is postcards. I loved placing her in this larger context of expedition photography. For her and a number of artists active during the 1970s, the photo postcard or mail art was the ideal medium in that it allowed artists to sidestep the world of commercial galleries and disseminate their work as widely as possible to as many people as possible. So, in the 19th century, it took a government commission or some wealthy person to support you. Here's someone in the 1970s sending these things through the mail as a way to not even deal with galleries. So over the course of 2.5 years, beginning in 1971, Antin mailed a series of 51 postcards to friends and people in the art world, documenting the progress of 50 pairs of black rubber boots crossing the United States from west to east. She carefully posed them and sequenced them in all different sites on the shore in California and here riding the Staten Island ferry. I hope some of you have already had an opportunity to see the beautiful meadow photographs by Barbara Bosworth upstairs in our Ritz Gallery. And here I'm showing you an earlier series by Bosworth, a Massachusetts-based photographer and longtime friend of our department. They're made with a large format camera, not unlike the ones used by Watkins or Ansel Adams. Beginning in 1991, she, this very modern artist, set out to make panoramic portraits of individual trees all across America, armed with the records kept by something called the National Register of Champion Trees. An organization that keeps track of basically the location of the largest known example of each species of tree, the largest of its kind. At times, she found that the trees were so massive or their trunks were so broad that even her 8x10 camera couldn't capture the entire specimen. Sometimes she tracked them down. For example, there's a wonderful one of an elm tree in the middle of a Kansas cornfield, and this one, which I love, in Washington State, where the tree is in a suburban backyard, with a picket fence and a swing. The next category that I focused on was the built environment, and that was a little bit of again, a challenging subject in that it really, it was a little harder to define than maybe the first series that I worked on, but it was really fun and exciting in the end as well. Much of this photography falls outside the sort of work I do, but you can also see, I'll show you in a minute, my favorite picture, which is very much a part of the collection I curate. As you can imagine, architecture was a popular subject for early photographers because in many ways it was, the 19th century was a period of rapid industrialization and urbanization, so there's lots of material and things to photograph, so lots of great subject matter for the camera. But it also, and this is kind of, good to remember, mostly at least it didn't move. And for early photographers, that was very important. So photographers could be photographing a building and recording streets and buildings, but many of their cameras early on couldn't capture things like the pedestrians on the street, for example. As we've seen already with photographers like Frith, Beato, Saltzman, and Murray, who traveled the globe to obtain images of far-flung architectural monuments. In this section, I also explored artists like Edward Baldus, who was working instead in his own city of Paris. And he was documenting construction, things being built going up at mid-century, so very contemporary and very local. In this case, he is recording the massive project to extend the wings of the Louvre along its north and south faces to attach to the Tuileries Palace at one end. The other thing that, again, maybe it goes without saying, but we sometimes forget, is the important thing was that photographs like these were reproducible and allowed for multiples to be made, and this was just the type of project where something like that would have been critically important. So not only was he able to carry out and expect to make more than 2,000 photographs of this structure in the course of this project, but he and his assistants also managed to print and compile them into presentation albums that then were given out by Napoleon III, and members of his circle received them as a concrete way to celebrate France's support of the arts. Later in the 19th century in England, there was also a bookseller turned photographer named Frederick Evans, and I show you this in part because I just love this photograph so much, but also as an example of one of the early works that did come into the collection before we began to collect so-called fine art photography beyond gifts. This was one of the first, this came into the museum in the 1940s, which was very early still. So Evans was a bookseller and someone who was well known for his beautifully crafted platinum prints taken of the rural villages and the cathedrals of England. He also made a striking series, of which this is one, that document the attics of Kelmscott Manor, one of which you can see here, made not long after the death of its owner, the arts and crafts designer, William Morris. I love it because it's a kind of study of white on white, but I also, just to note this, as a platinum print, it's going to have an incredible range of tone. It is fascinating, I think, to see how soft the light is, how the shadows fall on these rustic timber trusses and beams, and seem to, I think, all in all, represent something that he went on to describe to aspiring photographers who asked his advice. He said, "To wait to a building makes you feel intensely." And I look at this picture and think, this is someone who clearly was feeling intensely when he made this image. It's really spectacular in person. So slightly later in the United States, documenting avant-garde architecture and design was another way that photographers were used to further national aims and ambitions during the 20th century. In the United States, architectural photographer Fay Sturdivant Lincoln, F.S. Lincoln, here on the left, was among a new generation of commercial photographers eager to embrace the look of modernist design. For Lincoln and others of his generation, streamlined shapes and the smooth lines of modern architecture spoke to an optimism for the future that Americans were only then beginning to feel in 1939. He was hired to document the 1939 World's Fair in Flushing Meadows, New York, a job that he was very excited to be given, and his admiration for the design of the street of the future and the General Motors building here is clear, I think. Behind them, you can see the famous Trilon and Perisphere structures that became popular symbols of the fair and appeared afterwards or during the fair on postcards and souvenir china and everything in between. Also on the right, I'm showing the work of Ezra Stoller, an American renowned for his for his architectural photography of a slightly younger generation. He became famous during the 50s, 60s, and 70s for his stunning black and white images of the work of architects such as Frank Lloyd Wright at the Guggenheim, Mies van der Rohe at the Seagram Building, and here Eero Saarinen's TWA terminal at what was then called Idlewild Airport, now JFK. So perfectly, I think, capturing its sculpted concrete construction, the floating walkways, and the curving staircases. I love this photograph because it really feels as though you can visualize literally moving through the space. And architect Philip Johnson later claimed that a major building could not say that it was actually complete until it had been photographed by Stoller, and as he said, Stollerized. Now I hope you'll bear with me for a minute as I take us briefly back to the 19th century to Boston, just as a reminder that industrial and commercial photography has always been a very important subject of of architectural photography. And here I'm showing you one of the great masterpieces, early masterpieces of the collection, a daguerreotype that was made in the mid-1850s by the Boston firm of Southworth and Haas, but didn't enter our collection until 1994, so almost 150 years later. Southworth and Haas were famous for their powerful portraits of wealthy Bostonians, celebrities, and the political elite of the day. But this image is of McKay's shipyard, which is in East Boston, a really unusual, somewhat unusual subject for the pair of photographers, but a major shipyard that stands on what is today, the space that is what is today the area right around the ICA's watershed, if any of you have been there. This is a place that produced some of the most legendary clipper ships and merchant sailing vessels in Boston, and I love the way this photograph, this daguerreotype, documents the huge dry dock, the piles of lumber, and speaks to the massive scale of the enterprise, which, and then you can see the fully rigged ship in the distance. that would have been the end result of this. You can also make out, I think, that sort of glowing halo, that oval shape, that vignetting, which shows you that it had originally been framed and displayed in an oval mat. By the first half of the 20th century, at the height of the so-called machine age, photographers like Germaine Krul in France and Germany and Charles Sheeler in the United States rode the wave of optimism surrounding the industrial might of both countries between the wars. And they also greatly benefited from the rise in popularity of photo-illustrated magazines. And I know Kristen will mention some photographers working for magazines, and I know Anne did as well, including regularly commissioning photographers to document factories and industrial sites like these. Here you can see the Renault factory by Krul. This is right outside Paris from 1930, and the Ford Motor Company River Rouge plant in Dearborn, Michigan, made a few years earlier by Sheeler. In the case of Krul, she and many of her contemporaries had by this time begun to adopt the small handheld Leica cameras, and unlike Sheeler, who was still using the large format camera, so this is the photograph, the crisscross conveyors, that I would argue is my favorite because it's a real highlight of the Lane collection. He's still working with a tripod, and he is working with a large format camera. Sheeler was someone who was always happiest when there was nobody in sight. You know, he would wait, or either start early in the morning or wait until the shift had changed, so there'd be no sign of workers. But you see, she recorded not just the gleaming car parts that you can see here at the Renault factory, but also the workers who manned the assembly lines, and I think that's an interesting difference. The most interesting aspect of images like these for me is the way that this particular moment with figures like Krul and Sheeler, these artists who are working for magazines on commission and in these industrial settings, they really managed to straddle the world of commercial and fine art photography with such relative ease. And often the same picture might be used not only in the publicity material sent out by Ford, but also at the art show in Berlin. That's all about fine art, very avant-garde fine art photography. So used in both settings and sort of moving back and forth between those arenas very seamlessly. Here I'm showing you work by two other of my favorite photographers and one of my proudest acquisitions of recent years. This is what we would call a typology or a grid, what the photographers Bernd and Hiller Becher, German husband and wife team, often called families of objects, so groups of objects very related. In this case, 6 industrial building facades made over the course of the 70s and 80s, so not in one country or at one time, but all similarly studied with the camera for their form and for their function. They always approached their subjects in the same way, whether it was water towers, blast furnaces, gas tanks. They had a very strict and very formal rigor about their approach to their subjects, often choosing to focus on industries they saw as dying out across Europe and building types that were being threatened with extinction. They captured them with a large format camera, often in very even light, so there's virtually no shadows, frontally and from a set distance, so that these utilitarian structures are really transformed in these kind of taxonomies, these grids of like objects, so that all we can do is it's kind of like a little bit of a Where's Waldo, maybe to look at them and think about what are the differences between these objects, these subjects, what they went on to call anonymous sculpture. I just love this. And some of you may have been lucky enough to see the wonderful small exhibition recently on view at the Met on product photography. It was a really quirky show, and it was really fascinating. I think if you did see it, you'd agree that advertising photography is a really underappreciated and surprisingly affordable aspect of our field, and one I think deserves to be studied and collected more seriously. It's easy to forget sometimes that photographers needed to be quite creative to find ways to make a living. I've always wanted to do a show called the artist's day job. I've always been fascinated, like how people make a living and how they keep going as artists. And this was a period where commercial and advertising and magazine photography were fields that really boomed, and so that photographers who were willing to do the work, this is before TV gradually replaced so much of that print media, there was work to be had. And I was fascinated to realize working here at the museum, that one of my heroes, Joseph Sudek, that I know as very much a fine art photographer, someone who is making, windowsill still lifes and landscapes of Prague, was also working with a friend, Ladislav Sutnar, to publish house and tableware designs that appeared in postcards and calendars and other advertising campaigns like this one. So working with studio lighting, these very careful arrangements, these beautiful geometric forms, it was really fascinating to me. And these are the kinds of things that have kind of broadened our thinking about artists we thought we knew. And I couldn't resist showing this as well, because for one thing, my presentation is otherwise very U.S. and European centered, but I wanted to end this section with a work by a contemporary Korean photographer, Young-Mae Yoon, which was recently on view in the Hallyu exhibition that some of you may have seen in Gund. Talk about product photography. In this wonderfully humorous image, Yoon records her tiny daughter, who you can barely make out, slumped in a corner of her room, dwarfed by all the pink clothes, books, jewelry, school supplies, and toys that she was obsessed with at the time, the ultimate kind of weary consumer. And as a grandmother of girls, I can relate. So from here on in, I'm going to move more quickly and show you some of the incredible depth and breadth of our collection of portraiture that ranges across the history of the medium. But I want to not take too long, because I hope there'll be questions at the end. Although, as I mentioned, the very first cameras and photographs were incapable of capturing living, breathing likenesses, human likenesses, it wasn't long before shorter exposure times, faster emulsions, and advances in lighting made the photographic portraits commercially viable, even to those with very modest means. This led almost overnight to a steady clamor from the public for the pictures of themselves and of their loved ones. Because photography is a much more democratic and affordable form of portraiture, then you can imagine you could much more easily have a photographic portrait or afford a photographic portrait than, say, a painted portrait of yourself or your family. Still, in the 19th century, most people would only have had a handful, if not just one, maybe, photograph of themselves. So this is a very different moment we find ourselves in today. Like the John Murray paper negative and positive of Akbar's tomb in India that I showed you earlier, here I'm showing you another rare example of an early wax paper negative and the resulting print. Also from the 1850s. This is done by the French photographer Charles Nègre, who, like many of his contemporaries, had initially trained as a painter. So interesting to think about the fact that he's kind of handworking this image of his father, this wonderful portrait of his I think his father was a confectioner from Provence, had come to Paris to visit his son. He's seated out in front of his son's home. And because we have the paper negative and because we can look at the print very closely, our colleagues have been studying its surface and really can better understand not only the height and translucency of the negative, and you can see here again the blackening of the sky, which allows for that flat white sky. But we can also see that he hand-worked this details of both the front and the back of the negative and worked on the print. And interesting, I think, to think of the fact that he had trained as a painter, maybe braver in doing that than someone who had begun strictly as a photographer. It's a wonderful portrait and something we're really pleased to own. We're also incredibly lucky to have this mammoth plate, very rare daguerreotype by John Whipple, an American example made in Boston from about the same moment, but now a daguerreotype. So a unique, direct, positive image on a highly mirrored silver surface on a copper plate, so a unique object in a frame, a very different thing. It feels like a completely different animal. But this was made by Massachusetts-born photographer John Whipple, whose name might be familiar to some of you as the person who was famously photographed the moon not long after this picture was made in the late 1840s, early 50s, working at the Harvard College Observatory. He was a contemporary of Southworth and Haas, whom I mentioned earlier, the Mackay's shipyard. And Whipple established his own thriving portrait studio on Washington Street that featured a large skylit studio space. So, of course, this is before electric lights. So they had to have these huge skylights to light. And he was known for specializing in group portraits like this one. We have a wonderful colleague who's done a lot of research on this piece. We, in fact, didn't know it was Whipple for sure at the beginning. But one of the ways she was able to identify the studio is by the carpet, which I always loved. It's a very distinctive patterned carpet that appears and reappears in the images in Whipple's studio. The other thing to note about this is that, of course, there's a very different potential between something that's made with a paper negative that has a slightly painterly, slightly softer, you could kind of rework as Negra did on the paper negative. Here, this is an absolute, direct contact image. This is something that can't be messed around with, and you see every wrinkle, every detail in every face. It's spectacular to look at and spend time with. But it's also fascinating to think that this was a popular medium at the beginning, because many of us could not have, I don't think, tolerated the experience of being photographed. It was really quite, it doesn't bring out necessarily the best in everyone in the picture, but he had a real knack for capturing a group of people in a single exposure like this. Another pair I particularly love are these two studio portraits, both made in the United States, and representative of the steadily growing numbers of businesses like this that were growing up during the mid-19th century. Photo studios, large and small, were pretty much a given in any even small-scale town by the second half of the 19th century. And Frederick Gudekunst on the right had a studio on Arch Street in Philadelphia, which is one of the city's most successful just before the end, just during and just after the Civil War. He was known for having made very famous portraits of famous people like Ulysses S. Grant and Walt Whitman and the painter Thomas Eakins, but it's this little boy, this pensive little boy at his desk that just, I don't know why this picture just slays me. I think it's so powerful and so amazing. Seated in his chair with leaning against the table with his head resting on his hand. This would have helped, of course, with the still relatively long exposure to keep his head still and keep him comfortable seated at the desk. He's seated with a Leyden jar, so the open book and the Leyden jar, which is a reference probably to Benjamin Franklin and the fact that this is Philadelphia. It makes great sense. On the left is work by George K. Warren, who may be a name that some of you know if you've ever looked at old yearbooks or pictures of campuses on the East Coast in the U.S. He was someone who began his career in Lowell, Massachusetts. He was a daguerreotype photographer to begin with, but very quickly shifted gears, realizing that if he made albumin prints, so began to work in the positive-negative process rather than that single unique daguerreotype, that he could mass-produce photographs and market them in an entirely new way. So he developed this very lucrative business once he switched to albumin, and he became known. He moved to Cambridge, Massachusetts. He moved his studio to Cambridge, and he became known as the person who ran the studio that would go up and down the coast to all the universities and colleges and photograph the campuses and photograph the students. And in this case, he's made a portrait, I think a wonderful portrait of a black tradesman in New Haven who sold apples and candy to the students at Yale for many years and was such a well-known and beloved figure on campus that his portraits by Warren appeared in the yearbooks year after year. At the start of the talk, I mentioned the fact that donors and their collecting focus could also sometimes impact the makeup of our collection, and that's very much the case here. A far-flung collector friend who has deep roots here in Boston not so long ago, introduced us to the phenomena of the hidden mother. This is something I don't know about my colleagues, but I had never heard of. I had never heard of this idea that during the Victorian era, mothers and sometimes nursemaids were often asked by studio photographers to cover themselves, to hide themselves, and hold their child still because a child might not be comfortable in a neck brace or one of the other contraptions that people often had to use. I just love these, often kind of humorous images. But it's also interesting to consider, it's sad for the mother, of course, who's not in the picture, but also interesting to consider the sort of central importance of the child in a period where infant mortality rates would have been, so high, and otherwise photographs of children, there were so many often posthumous, death portraits of children of this age, that this was a way to sort of counter that. And I didn't realize how popular they were, how ubiquitous they were, but we have a beautiful large group of these thanks to this particular donor. And here's another pairing like the one I showed you earlier, where it's an earlier and much more contemporary portrait that I also enjoyed discovering in the process of doing this research for the book. On the right is a wonderful group of 6 anonymous siblings all in a row. That's hard to say if you have a lisp. 6 anonymous siblings all in a row, taken by the firm of Notman Photographic Company here in Boston during the 1890s. This is a work like the earlier work that I mentioned, works that I mentioned that come to us from the Curler project. So these are things that our colleagues in the print department, prints and drawings, are looking in the Curler project and finding these amazing examples of early photographs and photomechanical images. By the late 19th century, Canadian photographer William Notman had opened branches of his successful Montreal studio. So he was someone who was he's branching out into the United States and had not one but 2 studios, Notman Studios, on Park Street. So there were different family members running different studios. So this was an incredible business. This is a period now where there are electric lights and there are, now they're working with dry plates instead of wet plates that have to stay damp. Things are being streamlined and the process is being eased and exposures are faster. And this type of casual, expressive, group portrait of a group of children was newly possible. And that I found fascinating to look at this picture and think about that. This would have been something that the Notman brand would have proudly advertised as something they could do that other studios might not be prepared to do. And this cabinet card was something that was then sent to Curler here at our museum and kept here as an example of the Notman studio production. On the left is a recently acquired work by a North Carolina-based artist, India Beale, so working today, from a series she calls Am I What You're Looking For? For this project, she photographed some of her female students at Winston-Salem State University, a historically black college. She invited the young women in her classes to pose in their family home wearing job interview outfits, standing in front of a fabric backdrop. And the backdrop, as you can see, that's held up by that frame, represents a very kind of anonymous-looking corporate workplace that Beale herself had worked in years earlier to put herself through Yale Art School. The only black person in that office when she worked there, and the only black person in her class at Yale. So very much wanting to sort of introduce her current students and their aspirational, goals and their dressing up for their job interviews and putting them into that space and talking to them about their experiences. She was very interested in kind of recording their experiences, and she asked them to, so she's not just capturing their likeness, but she's recording some of their personal experience and them talking about questions that had been broached to them about, for example, whether they'd be willing to change their names or their outfits or their hairstyles in order to land a job. So very interesting to me, a very interesting kind of bringing that conversation about portraiture forward in time. I also think I mentioned that we have a wonderful sort of incredible supporter and donor to our collection. I think we have over maybe between 1,000 and 1,500 snapshots in the collection. Many of them pictures of people, and like the Hidden Mother tintypes, these came in a very substantial group from one person and overnight transformed our collection. So again, to sort of think about a collection doesn't grow always in a very incremental, very even, linear way, but this was a strange and wonderful experience that we all got to do together to collect this material together. Here I'm showing you just two of the more than 1,000 photographs and photo booth portraits and albums that we now own thanks to the collector Peter Cohen in New York City. In this digital age, of course, all of us know that if we make a photograph like the one on the right where the subject's heads are cut off or whatever, we can immediately erase it just with the sweep of a finger. But what's fascinating is to look back at this moment when images like that would have been retained and kept in someone's album, that people would know that's Aunt May or Uncle so-and-so with their distinctive purse or shoes or whatever it is. And I just love that those have been saved, even though, of course, they're untethered from the families that originally owned them. They're here, and we're thrilled to have them in the collection. They really help us think about our other holdings in very new ways. And I also would say that in this moment that we find ourselves where we are almost solely, sort of experiencing photographs on screens, it's very interesting to think about the objectness, the object quality of snapshots. These are things you can hold in your hand and look at closely and don't disappear when you lose your phone. So I'm just showing you two of my favorites here. Maybe I'll leave it there. So I want to show you too the Chris Killip, which is on the cover of the book. It was hard to choose one image to represent the this entire sort of idea rethinking of the collection, but I wanted to mention a few last examples of ways that photographic portraits of individuals have sometimes been asked to sort of stand in for larger groups or represent communities. And this is an idea that particularly interests me, and I think is interesting to think about the sort of potential uses and abuses of the photographic portrait, and how this can sometimes be celebratory and can sometimes be uncomfortable. I think we can all agree that there's no such thing as an entirely neutral representation of another individual, but I would argue that the best portraits suggest a balance of power between subject and photography, and that isn't always easy to achieve. But that was the case with what British photographer Chris Killip set out to overcome in documenting the plight of a working class youth in the northeast of England during the 1970s and 80s. So this is one work from a larger series from that period. He knew he was an outsider. He knew he was there to witness something that he was not necessarily a part of, even though he was British. He was from elsewhere. He was trying to record the realities of this deindustrialization of this region and the impact on the people there. But he traveled to this place, to the sea coal camp, which is people who collect the mineral sea coal out of the ocean in Northumberland. And he was very aware, as I say, of his outsider status. So he lived in a caravan on the beach for over a year to gain the trust of the local residents and to make this series of photographs like this portrait of Boo on a horse, which we all particularly love. We love the photographer and we love the work. And so it seemed like a great example to feature on the cover. I also wanted just a few more things. I wanted to show you this 1920s photographer, August Sonder, the work on the right. Sonder in the 1920s was inspired to undertake a systematic documentation of all of the country's citizens, to find a way to create what he described as a kind of visual catalog, or sort of a mirror of the time. And to that end, he produced a series of hundreds of these archetypal portraits rather than individual. So this is meant to be very much, she is she is not necessarily known, her name is not given. She's described as the architect's wife, even though Dora Lutkin was a member of his close circle of friends in Cologne at the time. She is very much meant to stand as the architect's wife. And his impulse was to place her in this kind of larger anonymous taxonomy to kind of represent the whole of all of the citizens of the 20th century, which is a very kind of crazy idea, but something that he really was hoping to achieve. Opposite Sonder, I'm showing you something very different in the work of Zanele Maholi, who in 2012, so working in South Africa, Zanele Maholi is an activist and photographer who's part of made this extended series, entitled "Faces and Phases" of the LGBTQ community that Zanele Maholi is part of in Johannesburg. And unlike Sonder, Maholi very consciously identifies each subject by their full name and location so as not to relegate them to a place of invisibility or anonymity. And these incredibly powerful portraits are really almost life-size. I think Anne and Chris and I will never forget standing in the room trying to decide which one from the series to choose. It was a really amazing group of portraits and some of my favorite. This is one of my favorite pictures in the collection. It really endows a dignity to the sitter, a real sense of agency and inner strength and a power that I think are, as you can imagine, are much needed qualities in the face of the kind of violence and harassment that many of these of Zanele's peers were regularly experiencing in South Africa at the time. And I'll just end with these two images and to say that these are two very recent acquisitions. If any of you regularly go to the Griffin Museum, these were part of an exhibition that we were very excited to see. An early exhibition representing a really interesting group of indigenous photographers from a number of different cultures and parts of the world. And this is the work of Kili Yuyan, who's a Chinese-American photographer. If you know the name Kili Yuyan, he is working for National Geographic sometimes, so you see his work in magazines. But he comes from a indigenous Siberian, his maternal grandmother is indigenous Siberian, and told him stories of her upbringing and very much kind of excited him with the stories of his heritage and very much made him want to go back and study people from the area that she was from. And we also have a relatively new MFA colleague, Marina Tequenko, who some of you may have met, who's a Native and Indigenous artist specialist and curator, and she has been working in tandem with us to build a collection of Indigenous photography, which is a very new thing for us. Kili Yuyan is working with a group called the Yupik people, who are based, in this case, on an island in the Bering Strait, part of Alaska, in the Bering Sea, part of Alaska that is very much cut off from the rest of the continent, and where the community of only about, I think, 700 people struggle with alcoholism and drug abuse and very high suicide rates. So a community that struggles in some ways to survive in a very, challenging environment. Yuyan, wanting to work there and wanting to know more about the Yupik people, decided that it was very important that he wanted to work with the young people, and he wanted to show them that, this goes back to, the idea that Chris Killip, spent a year living with the people he was photographing. Kili Yuyan wanted to show the young people of Gamble, Alaska, that he was in it for the long haul and wanting to collaborate them on a longer running project. And he suggested to them that they do an extended project that involved making masks that represented their different feelings, their most innermost feelings, that ranged from, extreme grief to the most joyful faces. And so they made the masks, and then were invited to pose themselves wherever they felt that emotion the most, the strongest. And this series just, I can't even explain why this was so moving to me, but I really was excited that we were able to acquire 2 of these works from this series. And I think, I hope this is only the beginning, because this is something that really we need to build this part of our collection, and this is a great start. So I'll close there, and I hope that my excitement surrounding this project came through, and that you'll look for our book when it comes out, and please do let me know if I can answer any questions for you. Thank you.
We have time for Q&A, so anybody who has a question, if you could please raise your hand, and I will bring the mic over to you.
I wonder what shutter speeds were used in those early prints, and whether this bore any relationship to the often very serious facial expressions that people showed.
Yeah, it's a very good question, and I'm not great on the technical aspects. I can tell you that the very earliest exposures were sometimes, just incredibly long, so close to a minute, for someone to have to literally be braced, have their necks held, in place. But very quickly, it was seconds rather than minutes. But if you've ever tried to stay still for even seconds, you realize how long that can feel and can be. I've already forgotten the second half of your question. I'm sorry, but yes, that was a great comment, because we've actually had some lengthy conversations about where I comment that someone has a somber expression, and everyone points out that, in fact, the idea of a smile is actually a very 20th century idea anyway, to begin with, that there wasn't ever a sense, if you look at a painted portrait, you don't see someone with a big smile on their face or any kind of, look of recognition for the person painting them. So this was really a 20th century idea, and not very common in the 19th century, but I'm sure you're right that if you are holding your head still or trying to brace yourself in any kind of way, that a serious expression it made much more sense, and that's what you would be getting. I wish I could tell you exactly how long the exposures were, but it was fascinating in the 19th century how that march of technology, those transformations from one process, the wet plate to the dry plate to the gelatin silver print, the albumin print to the gelatin silver print, the camera on the tripod and large format to the handheld, every step of the way, every development or improvement just made just a massive change in the whole, the look of photographs, but also what people could do, what people expected. I'm really fascinated by the change that took place once everyday people owned cameras, and that's part of the reason the snapshot collection has been so eye-opening for us. The idea that until the late 19th century, when Kodak, introduced the personal cameras like the Kodak Brownie and the other Kodak cameras, people had to go to a studio. You had to have that. You had to be able to pay someone to take the photograph for you, because you were not going to have that camera in your, in your own space or have that potential opportunity. And so that's always struck me. I've always been interested in how that changed. And we have photo booth pictures from the 1940s and 50s, and how interesting to think what that would be to, how freeing for someone like a young black man, for example, to sit in a photo booth and have a machine take your picture and not worry that, that somehow the photographer was going to, that it wasn't a happy experience necessarily to be in a studio. And this was very liberating as well. So anyway, it's a very good question, and I can't even imagine. I would be horrible at that sitting still side of things. So.
If you wouldn't mind using the...
We're accustomed, sorry. in the digital era, we're accustomed to modifying the picture, after it's taken to the point where sometimes it's unrecognizable from
Right.
what was actually taken with the camera. But even in the darkroom and film era, you could do a certain amount of modification, in the darkroom during the development process.
Right.
And I'm just wondering whether in these really early phases of photography in the 19th century, whether they could do any post-processing, if you want to call it that, or whether what you took is what you got.
Yeah, for the most part, that was the case. But that neg portrait of the the negative and the print of his father with the top hat, that was a rare example where we can see the hand working. We can see how much, really, how much he reworked the image in, at the stage of the negative. There was very little that could be done in the darkroom early on, and of course, a daguerreotype was a direct positive, and so there was no changing what you got, and that's why I was commenting about, it wasn't necessarily the most flattering process. It was very much more popular in the United States. Interestingly, we as a culture seem to have had a tolerance for our looking at our wrinkles, where the European photographers were much more typically working with the positive-negative process, where there was more ability to do that kind of retouching. But yes, that's the other thing about, I'm really interested in the fact that now that we're experiencing photographs on screens and that we have that ability to modify what things look like. If you're interested in this, the last lecture in the series is being given by Fred Rich, and it's all going to be about artificial intelligence and the impact that's having on photography. I think it's really going to be fascinating for all of us, because it really does feel as though at every turn, almost with every century, we get to a different stage of photography, and now we're in the digital age, but now we're very quickly moving into the age of artificial intelligence, and I don't know if any of us are ready. But it's a very good question. Thank you.
Could you say a little more about how you chose, the whole process of
Sure.
choosing from 6,000
Yeah.
images, and who gets the say, and
No,
just
I'd love
do you
to.
have goals? I mean, do you have a structure?
Right.
Different.
I should have shown the slide that Anne showed last week in case you weren't here. She showed how the book is divided into the categories it is. And I was joking that, this may be the first time in my life I thought I didn't get the best assignment. I got the scary, hard part, but it ended up being great. But we each chose. So we looked at our collection, which is, mainly would be described as a fine art photography collection, as most museums would. And then between the Curler Project and all the other holdings within the museum, we began to realize, we have photographs of expeditions and excavations in Egypt. We have, architectural photography of Greek and Roman monuments that are in other departments that have, we have a museum full of photographs that have come to the museum for very, very different reasons, this group of things in the prints and drawings department. So we suddenly, not even suddenly, we sat down and thought, okay, we've done the fine art. We've really talked about that material in so many different ways. Let's think about this. Let's use this centennial as an opportunity to think about all the other ways that photography has come and been used by the museum. And so we basically set out to sort of identify all those categories. So fashion and celebrity, all the things that Anne spoke about last week, and then a huge amount of, most photographs being made in the 19th century were portraits. And so that was really just a question of how to even divide that up, because it was sort of like, the photographic portrait as self-representation, or the photographic portrait as a way to represent yourself as a member of a group or a larger community. So, loosely dividing things that way. But we recognize we could have done this book 100 different ways. And some of it has to do with the quirky nature of the museum's collection, which is, if another museum did this, it would be a very different book. So we are representing what we have, our strengths, some of the rarities within our holdings, and then dividing, in my case, these 4 categories, the 2 types of portraits, the built environment, so that included, industrial and product photography, advertising photography, and the surveys and expeditions and travel, which was the first one I tackled. It was really, it was a handful and a really interesting exercise. Both my colleagues are here in case they want to add to my comments, but it was really an interesting exercise, and we're very excited. The book should be out in a couple weeks. We do have a couple copies, but should be in the shop soon. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Karen.
Thank you.